This is to keep expanding the portfolio, if you will, of things from relatively easy and relatively not onerous to, some things that are tough. So with that, Abby, I'm going to hand you the mic to hold. You got your waddle
Great,
there.
and thank you. Like, this isn't my presentation. So here we're going to jump into what can we do. And I'm going to present, I think, about 12 different kind of buckets of actions. Thank you. Here we go. So you've heard on the urban side, examples of what has been done, on the agricultural side, what has been done, what some options are. And now I'm going to try to help you organize these thoughts within your minds. So all of these actions are part of our overall portfolio, or rather they could be, right? So as far as groundwater savings go, we have existing actions. So there are things in place. You've heard about that. There are projects that are being considered. I presented those other things that we're not talking about here today that are already at least being considered and under either being implemented like CSIP or feasibility studies underway. And then we have future actions. So here is really where we're concentrating and trying to really open up as to what could those future actions be. Now we have an existing system, so we're not talking about should we get rid of our reservoirs, change our overall system. We have a great system. There's been work done in this valley for decades that has put in place the reservoirs, CSIP, things that are already helping us move forward. We're talking really about how do we take that next step as a community? And specifically, how do we deal with uncertainty? The uncertainty and overall or unavoidable challenges is something that we're going to continue to have to grapple with in the future. We've seen droughts, we've seen floods, we've seen these fluctuations, and how do we move forward and address things like droughts as they occur, growth that may occur, change in demand patterns or crops, infrastructure failures. So what happens if you have an infrastructure failure? How do you deal with that? And regulatory changes, things that we don't even know might occur. Prior to Sigma, we didn't know that was coming, right? That's a new thing that changed where we're going. So how do we deal with that? And how do we plan ahead and be prepared for those ups and downs and new situations? And generally, how can we do that together, right? This is SVB-GSA bringing this to you. There are many agencies that manage water in the valley, but what's really appropriate for us here in Salinas Valley? How do you want to implement that? Who should implement it? Those harder questions that we need to get to in the future. We're not going to fully grapple with that today, but as I go through these various actions, keep some of these questions in mind and be thinking about, okay, so maybe I didn't want to consider this, or I didn't previously consider this one that Abby's presenting in this valley, but is it appropriate here? In what form would it be appropriate? Implemented by who would be appropriate? How to incentivize that? Have these questions in your mind to kind of push yourself further to think, well, what do we want here as a community? How do we want to work forward to deal with uncertainty in the valley? So tried to classify actions and break them down in a couple different ways. One is temporary versus permanent. So you can have actions that are permanent, they're put in place, you retire land and it is forever retired from being irrigated, or temporary. You put them in place during droughts or for a period while you're trying to make some change, but not necessarily forever. And some of the actions ride the line between them. You could make them temporary or permanent. Reliance of benefits. So some actions you can put in place 1 year and not have them another year. Or other ones you put in place, and once you put them in place, they're there, right? Once you have those reservoirs, they're not going away, they're there. It's a big project. And so try and classify them as far as how flexible are they for you to use. And then also, I guess, along with that, are they dependent on rainfall? Are they dependent on public participation or many individual growers adopting something? And that might also drive how appropriate it is or how you incentivize it. And so as you think about, okay, how much benefit would we get from a particular action? Is that because everybody's adopting it? You need a certain percentage of growers adopting it or individuals adopting it? How do you get that percentage to actually adopt something or change their practices. All of that factors into how much could that really help us, right? And then how do we compare that to other actions? Voluntary versus obligatory, that's another one of those dividing lines. And sometimes there's wiggle room in between. Is it something that you're saying, great, you should have a low flush toilet, or you should do this. Here's one of the best management practices we heard about, and it's more telling people about it, and then some growers or some people adopt it, but it's not required. Or is it something that is required, that is in some way obligatory? And then your response rate of how many people adopt it is different typically than voluntary. And then the cost, of course. Everybody cares about the cost. It's part of what we're looking at. There are different ways to slice and dice costs, and broadly we've simplified them here as far as low, medium, or high. It's a lot more nuanced than that, and a lot more variable in ways that depend on how something would be implemented. So take this as like an initial starting point, but not the end all, exactly what the cost will be. There is the cost of an agency to actually implement a program, whether it is building awareness of something, doing workshops, building a website, going out to the field for assistance. There's that agency cost. And then there's also the cost to whoever's adopting it, right? That would be the growers, the individuals. It could be a foregone cost if you don't have a crop that year. So there's the initial implementation cost of setting it up. There's usually also costs over time to maintain a program or maintain receiving those benefits over time. And so I won't go into all of those nuances here, but it will be something as we go forward and figure out what's appropriate for this valley, we'll have to grapple with that and grapple with who bears the costs as well. What's that cost sharing so that we can advance as a community? Okay, so let me start with, this is not an exhaustive list. These are some of the actions trying to broaden what you think about in terms of demand management. I asked you earlier what you think of in terms of demand management, and I'll be curious just in side conversations later if there were any ones here that you didn't consider previously. And this is also not necessarily the list for Salinas Valley. These are options. They may or may not be appropriate here, but we're trying to really think about, okay, what could come in this bucket? Generally, I mentioned they're ranked from low cost to high cost. Big generalization there. We'll get there down the road. They can also be implemented together or separately, and some of them do rely on having multiple at the same time. So you'll see the interplay between a couple of them as we go on. And then there's obviously variations of them that comes out in the implementation in how you actually design something to implement a program. So easy one to start with is urban conservation. You heard earlier about the city of Salinas, what's being done there. There are efforts with municipalities, in part, as we heard, driven by the state and the state mandates. They've been working on urban conservation, typically through permanent programs that they put in place, but that are voluntary, right? It's trying to get people to adopt low flow appliances, for example, and trying to get it, while it may be obligatory for the municipalities because of state laws, it's often voluntary by those adopting it. Do you want to? It's encouraging people to adopt it, but not mandating that everybody has a low flush toilet and there will be a penalty if you don't have it, right? So that feeds into the compliance rate or how many people adopt it and therefore what your savings are from that. This is typically low cost. It depends how much time or effort you put into it. And there's also distinction as far as we heard from the municipalities that have implemented things. We also have areas that have smaller water systems that might not have the same types of programs. So as you're thinking of, and depending on what part of the valley you're in, do you have systems that haven't had programs like this? What percentage of people do have low flow toilets or have adopted these measures? And then what's the role also for agencies like SVB-GSA to help promote that? And maybe it's different in different parts of the area, in part depending on what's been implemented already. So what are those additional gains that could be had? And then typically these are reoccurring benefits. Once you have your low flush toilet, you have an efficient toilet as long as that toilet is operational, right? A second option would be decentralized residential water capture. So also on the residential scale, What can households do? And so these water savings come from things like storing rainwater in rain barrels, typically for non-potable use, irrigating your landscapes, for example, so then you're not drawing the groundwater basin for irrigation, right? It's an alternative supply by capturing that rainwater. These are typically permanent. So once you've got your rain barrel, you use it. Voluntary, again, similar to urban conservation, it's really hard to require these, in part because it requires action by many individuals to do it, right? Typically low cost, although it depends on what and at what scale you implement it. I have a rain barrel similar to one of those, but I've seen people with huge cisterns, even for individual households, right? Although you also have to look at, when you're looking at the benefit, when you would accrue it. So one challenging thing with water capture here versus where I got my rain barrel in DC is it fills during the rainy season, and then during the dry season, once you empty it, it's empty until it rains, right? And sometimes we go months without really getting a lot of rain. So we actually don't even have it hooked up now, I'm embarrassed to say. I used it a lot in DC. It was basically all I used to irrigate my garden in DC because it would just refill multiple times a month, right? And here it's just really hard because it doesn't have that much capacity, right? And obviously around the valley too, we see different precipitation in different places too. So different things to consider as we look at what would be the benefit and then that cost benefit depending on the cost of the rain barrel and what that looks like from the user, right? In DC, they came to my house, free to me, they installed the rain barrel, they cut my drain pipe, put it in, all I had to do was show them in, it was great. I've not figured out how to cut my drain pipe here, which is my other problem, right? So like thinking about this as far as the implementation side and how that addresses the adoption rates of these. Again, this also has reoccurring benefits once you do put it in place, assuming you continue to have it in future years or individuals have it. On the agricultural side, we just heard from Michael Kahn on best management practices. So an agency could promote best management practices. Norm talked about everything that's been done in this valley. And we'd be looking to all of you and to sub-basin committees to know, okay, well, where can there be additional benefits? It tends to be at events like this. We tend to get those who actually have implemented everything, so we're preaching to the choir. A lot of folks tend to already have done a lot of things, but where do you see people that haven't adopted, growers that haven't adopted things, where it might be appropriate to adopt other conservation measures to make things more efficient? What would those be, and then how can they be incentivized? What would cause people to actually put them in place? These tend to be permanent. Once you put them in place, you have them as long as you maintain them. Typically voluntary. It's really hard to go out and enforce these best management practices unless they're tied towards some broader program. Typically low cost from an agency perspective. We'll get to later as an option of this is to actually offer incentives as well. Depending on what your incentives are, that changes the cost of it. But just saying, here are best management practices tends to be a fairly low cost action for an agency. And then you get the reoccurring benefits year after year. So a third one, and I realize some of these, this one in particular, a couple of them are very uncomfortable to talk about. This is generally a very uncomfortable conversation, and we will get to places where we consider what is appropriate for the valley. However, for the purposes of the presentation, as I mentioned, we're trying to get that wider bucket. So limit place of use is one that may or may not be appropriate here, but it is an option. It tends to be done on a county scale. And so it's not something that necessarily would be one neighbor to another, sub-basin to sub-basin. We've seen it in California as far as a county where their water may be used in another county saying, nope, you need to use it within this county, so within this geographic area. And by limiting that potential export or shipping that water elsewhere, then it tends to be you do that when it is to some detriment of the place where the water is being taken from. So some limit, it can be temporary or permanent, but it's typically obligatory, right? It's not, well, we don't want you to, right? It's you can't move it beyond this area, and that has to be defined. So may or may not be appropriate here. Tends to be low or lower medium cost to put in place. But once it's put in place, you do have those benefits if water was being taken elsewhere. previously, right? Another one is to provide water use data. So we've heard this a couple times throughout the course of the day. These water savings come from individuals, individual growers, assessing their individual water use and increasing efficiency. We talk about this, and when we put this together, I was thinking more on the agricultural side as far as getting that data that we heard about earlier and how you can use that to get more efficient practices. Although Perrette also talked about how that can work on the household side and how that has in Scotts Valley, where she previously worked, right? So this tends to be permanent. You put it in place, you have those systems. You do need to maintain it or continue to have those data platforms in the future, but setting them up is an initial effort to do. Tends to be voluntary. We're offering the data, or an agency would be offering the data, not obligatory. You can use it if you'd like to. Medium cost to implement, and then have some ongoing cost to maintain. And then likely reoccurring benefits year to year. If it is, I didn't realize I'm blocking the screen. If you do have it and people can continue to realize those benefits. So providing water use data, another good question is, how can it be used? Who uses it? And what's the role of an agency like SVB GSA in promoting that, right? Fallowing. So I've got a couple different iterations of fallowing in here. I know it's a scary topic, but it is something to think about as far as totally irrigated acreage and what is the community approach to that if pumping needs to be reduced in any year, either specifically during a drought, for example, a finite time period, or on a longer term basis. So fallowing, for those of you that don't know, is when agricultural land is idled, so groundwater is not pumped for irrigation. You still need to manage the land. We heard earlier about cover crops. It's not just leave it there and let the dust go, right? There is still some management there, maybe a little bit of water use associated with that too, but the overall idea is to bring down the pumping from not growing something on that plot of land or not irrigating it actively. So as far as what some options are for that, these tend to be medium cost actions, and I say that with a big arm waving caveat of there's a cost for the agency to implement. There's also with these a huge cost to the growers who are implementing them, and we'll get to the end of can there be cost sharing, or what are some what is a financial mechanism that can be used. So one option is to delay crop replacement. So where you have permanent crops like vineyards, delay, and you're going to already replace a crop, delay it by a year, right? Get those water savings from occasionally fallowing, not all the time, but just in those periods of transition when a crop is going to be replaced anyways. Tends to be a policy that would be put in place for this, temporary or permanent, depending on the conditions and what you're trying to address through that pumping reduction. It's typically voluntary, although can be obligatory. Typically low cost to the public, but the cost is borne by growers unless there's some financial mechanism there to help out. And then variable and likely low benefit every year. It really depends on what the crops are, what the water usage is on that plot, how it's put in place. Another option as far as how fallowing can be put in place would be rotational fallowing, more appropriate for the crops that really turn over a couple times a year, like some of the vegetable crops, right? So these water savings come from resting different fields on a rotating basis. So if you have 3 crop cycles per year, in this field, in the first part of the year, you fallow one field, grow on 2. During the second part of the cycle, you grow on the one that was fallowed and another one, fallow your third, rotate the crops that are fallowed. Or maybe it's not as intensive of a program that it's just every so often a field is fallowed. Tends to be a permanent program, tends to be obligatory, generally low cost to the public, but really depends on how it's designed. So is that cost borne by the grower, or is there some assistance, some broader financial assistance so that it's not really that huge cost to just those who are implementing it? And has recurring benefits every year that the program is in place. And finally, that financial mechanism. So this pairs with could pair with the other options. So it's not just, one grower or the growers that are implementing that are bearing the financial costs. How do we spread that? How do we, as a community, figure out okay, this is where we need to go, short-term basis, long-term basis, sparked at a certain point by certain conditions. But can there be a fallow bank where a larger group of growers or the community puts in funding that then is doled out to those who are actually doing the fallowing in any given year? So the water savings come from resting different fields in one of the ways that fallowing can be done, such as rotational fallowing. And all growers or all that contribute to that bank, and then that reimburses those who are doing the fallowing. Can be temporary or permanent, can be a voluntary fallowing, right? You have a bank, and if you're a grower that's amenable to doing it, then you are able to draw from that bank, right? Part of this depends on what the severity of what you're trying to deal with are. Is it ongoing? You've had these chronic lowering of groundwater levels that I've mentioned some areas of the valley have had, so you're really trying to bring those groundwater levels back up? Or is it, generally we're fine, but during droughts we get really hard hit. So like certain years, especially when we have those multi-year droughts, there needs to be some tightening. And so having some sort of mechanism to deal with that as a community, right? As an area as a whole. And then variable benefit every year, it depends on how it's implemented and by who, and at what scale, I guess. And then fallowing on a much larger scale would be repurposing or retiring agricultural land. So taking land that was irrigated, so used X amount of groundwater every year, and then taking it permanently out of production, right? So the water savings come from permanently stopping that irrigation or reducing it on certain parcels. Permanent tends to be voluntary option and high cost. So this is usually purchasing land. So purchasing land ideally with multiple benefits. So there's the multi-benefit land repurposing program that's underway now that's looking at, okay, are there ways we can be strategic about this and have other community benefits, access to trails, recharge benefits, ecosystem benefits on certain plots. But it's also, it needs to be done in a way that really works with the landowners, right? About where this is appropriate, what's appropriate, how you compensate. But you do get the recurring benefits year after year, and that can enable other areas to still have their irrigated agriculture. So we put that in the high cost bucket just because of the land purchase, but obviously depends on land price. Okay, two left, tiered extraction fees. So for these, the water savings come from an economic incentive to reduce water. And there's a couple different ways this could go. One is, as a couple people have mentioned, there could be an allocation. Each person gets, or each grower or acre gets a certain amount. And if you've got one cost for that, or none initially for low use, but if your water usage goes up above that allocation, then you pay a higher cost, and you can do that at premiums depending on how much is used. Another way is not necessarily with an allocation. There's no set amount that you have, but to encourage efficient water use on some scale, like per every irrigated acre, your first X amount of water use, you pay this amount. If you use more water for that, say you go 10 above that, whatever, you pay a higher amount on that second bit. Think of electricity bills. This is how electricity does it quite a bit, right? You have some baseline amount that everybody gets, that you pay a certain amount for, but if you're less efficient and you use more energy, the more you use, the more you have to pay. Also somewhat like taxes as well, right? You move up in tax brackets. Still, you had that baseline amount that was pretty cheap, but as you earn more and more, you pay more and more taxes at a higher rate, right? This can be permanent or temporary. It's difficult to make temporary, usually because it really involves thinking through how you do this, what's fair, who's doing it, at what amounts, being really, really thoughtful of the design of it is extremely difficult, right? And so you usually only do it if it is something you'll have in the future, or set it up so that it's set up and then can be triggered and used in drought years, for example, or in certain situations. It has to be obligatory. There's no way, it doesn't operate if you choose to pay more, right? Everybody would have to pay more once you get to those different tiers. So it must be set up in an obligatory way. Typically has a high cost or medium high cost for managing the program. It's a very active management, especially if it's something that is only at certain times, right? There will always be, cases where you apply it and then, oh wait, this this field changed and it wasn't what we thought it would be, and so there's got to be some management of the program. But you get reoccurring and potentially high benefits every year, and can be designed as a community would want it in what a community views as equitable. And finally, the one nobody wants to talk about, compulsory rationing. This we've seen a bit more on the urban side as we get into some of the severe droughts. I don't know if you've been in places that you've seen the no watering lawns at all, right? Or you can only water on Tuesdays, right? So some obligatory means that in some way, shape, or form is compulsory rationing. Doesn't necessarily mean all water use. It can be a certain type, like watering lawns, or tied to timing. But in some way, the water savings comes from enforcing strict limits on water use. So permanent or temporary, obligatory, typically has a high cost for managing the program because you have to have some enforcement there, right? If you don't have enforcement or some sort of penalty, then people won't necessarily follow it. But it does have reoccurring benefits and benefits that occur anytime that it's in place. So scary topic, I know. I know nobody wants to talk about these, but when we first actually California and Sigma came about, allocations were the way that people thought about demand management, right? It was that way, that's how it was envisioned. But really, when we're talking about, you can increase recharge or you can decrease pumping, there's many ways to decrease pumping, right? Some make economic sense, right? It's just more efficient water use. And it's really figuring out what makes sense and how does it make sense to put in place? How do we do that? How do we reach the groundwater conditions that we want in the basin together? Right. So we're gonna move on and do maybe I'll pause here for questions and then I'll get to the exercise, and we've simplified the actions in a certain way for the exercise, and so I wanna walk through that. But before we do, I don't really feel like leaving it on compulsory rationing, but maybe we'll take a few questions.
Yeah, let's open up the floor for Q&A, and then we'll move on to the exercise. Any questions?
I guess if we get more efficient with pumping, less, because we have more efficient irrigation systems, we're not really changing necessarily the evapotranspiration or the consumptive water use of these crops, right? In unconfined aquifers, if we're a little sloppy with the irrigation, what happens is that water goes back down into the ground. So we might not necessarily see changes in the groundwater, at least in this region, just by being more efficient with drip. So how would you think about that?
Very good question. It's part of the equation that we need to look at, right? We're gonna have a future. We don't quite know what the future looks like in terms of how much precipitation we'll get, what the temperature will be, how extreme the weather events will be, right? So there will be a future that we'll be dealing with. The groundwater basin, we are trying to get a better handle of that, and the groundwater model that we use is helping us start to look at that, so we'll be able to quantify that a bit better. We can also look at how close the groundwater levels are to the surface and some of those groundwater conditions. And we know in this valley, not as much in this area, but as you get closer to the coast, we also have a confined aquifer. So you can have recharge above it or return flows, but it's not gonna go down to your usable aquifer at that point. So it's part of the equation, and I think something we need to consider as we're looking at different options. And I should also note the other kind of side of the equation that isn't necessarily the quantity side, but that the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program deals with is what happens with water quality related to those crops too. So I don't have a perfect answer. I know I didn't fully answer that, but it is something that we need to look at, and we're trying to, with the model, gain a better understanding of what that interaction is. So.
It's good, Steve.
Thank you, Abby. I'm curious when you talk about ag land retirement, we've got conservation easements that a lot of trusts buy. Would we ever, or has anyone ever done a water conservation easement where you buy the water rights to a property? A community might buy those water rights?
Yes, can I call a friend over here?
There has been some recent efforts around, they call it groundwater easements. Somebody reached out and said, hey, have you ever heard about this? And it was in the context of the multi-benefit land repurposing program, because basically within the multi-benefit land repurposing program, the idea is you repurpose the land from irrigated agriculture into anything else really that's not going to use groundwater. And so really the only thing that's going to be, so you could do like dry farming, right? And so, or you could do solar panels. So the one thing that's being restricted is the groundwater in that case. And so an easement on that particular thing makes a lot of sense. And they're doing it, I always get the state backwards, Colorado or Wyoming. Colorado is where they're trying this out. And it is being talked about in the latest iteration of the Farm Bill as well. And the one caveat being that the person who's explaining this to me said, I don't have any idea how this would work with California water rights. It works in Colorado with their water rights system, and we don't really know how it would work with ours, but it is an interesting concept.
There's, many of you are probably familiar with managed aquifer recharge MAR and then flood MAR, which is extracting off of tributaries versus high flow during high flow conditions. And the same concept is being discussed in that context, because the underlying challenge of MAR is, and particularly flood MAR, is if you're extracting during flow conditions, there's this question of whose water is it? And if you're going to the infrastructure cost of applying and doing a MAR project, then it's at whose water is that underneath when you're approaching it from a correlative right perspective. So there's actually discussion about exactly this topic, because one could argue that there's a limited value of doing MAR if you're not going to have some sort of protectionist construct. So it's also being discussed there.
Great, thanks. And I don't know if Emily, you were introduced earlier, but Emily Gardner is Deputy General Manager for SBB GSA, leads on the multi-benefit land repurposing program and a lot of the agriculture side of things for SBB GSA.
These are all talking about conservation, which is important, and I realize that. But is there any talk about improving recharge with our existing infrastructures in place, whether it's more storage or cleaning out the river or anything like that?
Yes, and so this morning, when I showed the slide of how we can get there, we can increase how much water goes in the ground or decrease the amount coming out, and then the seawater intrusion question. Yeah, so we're just focusing here on that demand management question, but there are several different work streams going on as far as what can be done to increase putting more water into the ground. So.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
How are we going to differentiate between the SGMA is to manage groundwater? And in your legislation, it points out that water that's enhancement water is not under your privy. You're under native, natural, sustainable yield. So those reservoirs, the water it adds, different component. Goes into the same basin, but different component. CSIP, different component. Those are waters we've done to enhance as growers. It was a community, really. So how do we differentiate that and watch mission creep? I'm serious. There's, I'm sorry, but I'm from the government. I'm here to help. Nah, I ain't calling you back.
No, a fair point, an excellent point. So there's a lot of collaboration, and I'd say every year it's gotten stronger between Salinas Valley Basin GSA, Arroyo Seco GSA, Marina Coast GSA, the three groundwater sustainability agencies that are responsible for complying with SGMA. Their collaboration with Monterey County Water Resources Agency, which manages the reservoirs and CSIP, and Monterey One Water as well. Right, so there's really, what we've realized is it's groundwater here, but really groundwater and surface water we can't treat differently. And that's part of the reason we tried to frame the workshop in water management, even though, and then our subset as far as groundwater. It is related, right? And we are gonna continue to do this dance forever in this valley. And so there's no way we can separate them. It's really trying to figure out which agency should be doing what. And to the extent that one agency is doing it, sharing the benefits of that with the other ones and not duplicating efforts, right? So, but yeah, it's tough, and it will be tough forever here, but I think all the agencies really want to move together forward. And so,
Any other questions or comments? Okay, let's move right on into the exercise.